Welcome back to our workshop. Today I'm working on this vintage wood table. It's a bit of an ugly duckling right now, and I'm hoping we can make this into a beautiful swan. By looking at the top here, you can see it's a cloverleaf design, and the finish on the top has really been damaged. The turning details on the legs have some elegant details, and it has a matching cloverleaf shelf. And I love the way the table legs finish at the bottom. I purchased this table for myself. It was only $30 Canadian, which is about $20 US. It needs a lot of attention on the finish. Now, I can tell this has been refinished because there's no perfect crime when it comes to refinishing. And I'll teach you in this video how to look for signs of something that's been refinished. I'm also going to finish the top with a French polish. And I haven't done that before. This is going to be my first experiment doing that, so it's my own piece. It's going to really enhance the beauty of the natural wood here and elevate the style of this table. Stick with me, I'll show you how it's done.
As a furniture repair business, we're opening the doors to our workshop to show you the tools and techniques to repair furniture.
The front rail here, you can see this has been broken off.
We give you tips to make your repair projects easier. Let's get into the workshop and start fixing furniture.
When I saw a photo of this wood table online, I knew that it needed to be refinished. But it wasn't until I saw it in person that I could understand more about the quality of this piece of furniture and the finish that was on it. I'm going to turn it upside down and show you some of the signs that you can look for to understand if a finish is original or not. I can see that there's a little bit of stain and there's some clear finish here. But if I look along the edge here, I've got clear finish and then there's practically no finish here. Over here, there's some finish and then practically none here or here. So to me, this is telling me this is not a quality finish, so it's someone that's refinished this. On the underside of the table here, we've got variations in finish. I can see where the original stain was taken off and new stain was applied, but then you can see there are these drips and gobs. This is from someone that's refinished this. Here's another example of finish that was applied on the outside but not on the inside. So again, the refinisher didn't do a thorough job here. Another thing to look at is the quality of the finish. Because I've got this upside down, this was stripped and finished and it looks really nice. But under here, there's a whole bunch of gunk. So when someone stripped this, they didn't take all of the finish off and they just ended up putting more finish on. So that's a good hint that this has been refinished. I think the finish on this is a shellac, and that means this would have been finished probably a long time ago. Not many people refinish with shellac anymore. So I'm going to pull out my denatured alcohol here, give it a test, just to make sure. I just need to dab some denatured alcohol onto the finish here, and if it dissolves and it gets sticky, that means it's shellac. Yeah, it's breaking down, so it's a shellac finish. Shellac as a finish has been used for centuries, but when lacquer was developed, it quickly became a favorite in manufacturing because it dries so quickly. And when a finish dries quickly, there's little chance for little dust nibs to flaw the finish. So by the 1930s, most manufactured furniture was finished with lacquer. Now this not having a lacquer finish on it tells me something about its age, but there's also a label on this table. When you find a name tag like this on a piece of furniture, it can often give you some hints into the quality of the piece. I'll have to do some research on this company to see if I can find anything out about the vintage of this table. Now when I was purchasing this table, the thing that excited me was I flipped it over and I could see the solid wood. I could easily tell here that this is solid wood from these boring marks here where the screws go in. But look at this beautiful grain. This is going to make a beautiful table once it's refinished. When stripping furniture, you can get into some pretty harsh chemicals. I'm using a new product here called Strip-Wall. I've never used it before. And I don't like to expose myself to harsh chemicals. And in order to evaluate this, I'm going to get help from another YouTuber. Her name is Trena. She's from John's Furniture Repair. So I'm going to pack up this table, pack up some tools, and we're going to hit the road. And here we go. Trena is located in South Wolseley. That's about 3.5 to 4 hours from me. The closest major city is Detroit, Michigan, so over the US border.
Hi Scott, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good, come on in the shop, it's cold out.
It sounds good. So here's the table I was talking about, Trena. By the way, I love your shop. It's so
thanks.
big.
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. It's my dream shop.
So for those of you who haven't watched John's Furniture Repair on YouTube, Trena is the star of the show here, and she runs this business. She named it after her father. So your dad taught you all your skills?
Yeah, I grew up in the shop, so as soon as I could do anything useful, I was in there 100%, and I've just kind of taken it on, and it's my own thing now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So Trena does a lot of furniture stripping, and that's why I wanted to bring this to her to understand whether the strip well is working well for us.
Yeah.
The chemicals that come off of strippers, I don't want to expose myself to.
Yes, no you don't.
How do you manage that in your workshop?
Yeah, so this is an 1,800 square foot shop, so it's a large space, which is number one, really important. And then number two, having protection is always important. Using a vapor cartridge mask and having protection that way is good. But also we have fans. So I've got a giant spray booth that moves all of the air in the entire 1,800 square foot shop out in about 5 seconds. So if I have everything closed and I turn that fan on, it'll actually suck the door wide open. So it's pretty strong when we turn that on. A secondary thing we have here right at the workbench is an exhaust fan here. It doesn't move as much air, but it keeps things moving, and we do have windows open and things. So fresh air is always being drawn across the surface. And then, you know, if we're doing large pieces, which we're stripping, we'll do that in the spray booth or have the spray booth on while we're working in the shop, just to make sure there's as much fresh air kind of going through everything as possible.
Trena shared with me earlier that she's a teacher, that's her background in training, and I can see it coming out right now. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so in my workshop, I've got a one-car garage, very little ventilation. So I'm really curious to see this product, how it works, and see if it's effective. So we've got gloves, safety glasses, and respirators. We're all set to go.
All right, so it's been 15 minutes, and the instructions say you just need to put another coat on after 15 minutes, so I'll just go ahead and do that, and then we're going to wait for another 15 minutes.
Okay, Trena, so we put on 3 coats of this, right?
Yeah.
We're now at the 45-minute mark?
Yes, which is a long time, I must
Okay.
say. But anyways, let's see how it's doing. It looks really wet right here, and I think maybe the table's a little bit sloped too. But in here you can see like the flaking of the finish is kind of popping up here. And I'm not 100% sure if this is all shellac or if there's something else on here. But let's just give it a swipe and see how it looks after 45 minutes. I can feel that it's still pretty much hanging on underneath, but there's a top layer that's coming off. But yeah, that's still not down. So that's what it looks like there. Let's try where it looks a little bit more dry here. Yeah, pretty crusty. But you are getting, you know, quite a bit of material off on the top there. So whatever that is, it's coming off. And I'll just put that in my bucket. So I guess let's take off.
So remove what's on top, so then we're going to spray on another coat.
Yeah, and then we'll
let
just
it
do another
penetrate.
coat and see where we get with that one. But again, we are at the 45-minute mark here, and for a professional business, unless you situate your day where something is always sitting under stripper, that's a pretty long time to wait. And maybe I'm just spoiled with chemicals, but
Well, I'm curious to see how this is going to compare to what you regularly use.
yeah. And I am using pretty good pressure as well. And it did get stuff off. So it did do something.
Okay.
So let's put on another layer. And then I guess we wait another 15 minutes.
Yeah, the instructions say keep going every 15 minutes until you're happy with the results.
Until it's all off.
Hopefully this isn't going to be a 2-hour project. And when you scrape off into a can like this,
Yeah.
how do you dispose of a can like that once?
So this can, I obviously have to clean out the groove here, which I just let a bit of stripper sit on here. And these cans get sealed and they go off to toxic waste at the dump.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically it's just old finish is what I tell the dump. And they're like, okay, and they put it into their toxic waste.
Okay, this is looking a little different. So we're now at the hour point of this, 4 coats.
Yep. Let's see how it's going. Can still feel a little bit of finish underneath, and you can see it there too. Yeah, there's still a lot of finish being left here. We are getting it down in some parts here, but you can see all this shiny stuff that's left. And maybe this is the stuff that's not shellac, maybe it was just a lot heavier.
Yeah, it's really light right here.
Yeah, so you know.
Maybe that was the old finish that got worn through.
Yep. And maybe they didn't get any new finish on that section, so you were able to get through. And I mean, they do say it's for vintage finishes, so maybe this is a finish that has a little bit more of like a poly or something to it, who knows. So at this point, I think you would be looking at mechanical remover, and they do say, when I've seen them use this stuff on camera, the end of what they do is put a little bit more on, which is what I do with my stripper too, and then they take some steel wool, and this is number 1 steel wool, okay, and they actually use it to scrub off the rest of it. But I'm not sure if it's at the point where scrubbing is going to get a lot of it off. It does seem to be getting some of it off though. But yeah, you still have a lot of finish. If you can catch it in the light, there's finish all over here. I've just like burnished it so it looks a little bit smoother, but that's still 100% finish. And if I went to go sand that with sandpaper at this point, I would just gum up my sandpaper. Okay, so I'm going to use my chemical stripper here. I'm just going to put that on the half and see how it works out.
Oh, that instantly reacts.
Yep. And you just want to keep it wet, and then it's good to go.
And you don't need to wait?
Nope.
Oh.
You can wait like maybe 3 seconds, but it's good to go. And then I usually do 2 coats of this stuff too. And we'll just do another coat right away. And it should catch the rest of it. And then I'll just give it a little rinse for all of the waxes and stuff in the stripper.
Wow, I can't believe the difference between this side and this side, and the time.
Yeah, I think this was maybe 5 minutes, whereas we were at an hour and we're still not finished.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to work with me to figure this out, because me struggling with this particular new product would have been a challenge.
I'm glad you brought it because I wanted to try it too, because I've seen it on video and I've seen how it works so well. So I was really interested to see in person how it was, but maybe there's a lot of time passing on those videos that I'm not really seeing.
Thank you, Trena, for your expertise.
My pleasure.
And go to Trena's channel. Our channels are largely measured by the number of subscribers we have, so I encourage you to go to Trena's channel and subscribe and help her in her YouTube journey as she shares her skills on the internet.
Thanks, guys.
I've taken the table apart and I purchased the furniture stripper in the local hardware store. Now it's important that you read the safety data sheet when you're working with a new product. That way you know the precautions you need to take, and these ones are important. On a safety data sheet, you'll find various information about the warnings and hazards, and here's a few things that I highlighted from what I saw here. May cause cancer, may cause damage to organs through prolonged or repeated exposure. And down here under precautionary statements, only use outdoors or in well-ventilated area, and do not breathe the dust, fumes, gas, mist, vapors, or spray. When I turn the page over and look at the first aid measures, there's something here that really concerned me as well. It says here, in confined or poorly ventilated areas, vapors can readily accumulate and cause unconsciousness and death. Statements like these make me understand how serious this product really is. So how do you protect yourself? Well, there's also instructions on a safety data sheet on how to protect yourself with personal protective equipment, PPE. For eye protection, we need goggles, hand protection, chemically resistant gloves, and respiratory protection. This is really important. Atmospheric levels should be maintained below the exposure guideline. When respiratory protection is required, use an approved air purifying or positive pressure air supplied respirator depending on the potential airborne concentration. So what does this mean? Well, the most powerful cartridges I have for my respirator are organic cartridges, and these protect me from things like epoxy fumes. But this chemical is much stronger than that, and the only thing that you can use is something that's providing fresh air. And what that means is I'm not going to be using this in my workshop because I don't have adequate ventilation. To protect myself, I need to be working outdoors. If I had a spray booth like Trena does, you could use it in a spray booth because you've got lots of ventilation there. So I'm going to get this stuff set up outside, strip it down, and then we'll take a look at the funky color I've got going on here and decide what to do with it. If you look at the front of the shelf where I put the stripper on, you can see it's already reacting. It's getting into the finish and starting to lift it. This is the power of chemicals and being able to work on finishes. It's just unfortunate that they're so toxic. That's why I was hoping Stripwell might have been that less toxic option for me. One of the keys to success when you're stripping furniture is to make sure that you keep the furniture stripping area wet. You need to keep it wet at all times because if it starts to dry out, the material will lock up on you and get solid again. So what I'm doing here is just putting on a second coat to keep it all wet, and that way when I go to scrape it off, it's going to lift up. If you're working in hot conditions, you'll need to apply it more. Windy conditions can affect it as well. So something to consider. And also make sure you're working in a shaded area and not in the direct sunlight.
Please give us a thumbs up so more people will see our videos.
When it comes to scraping, I use a putty knife at a very shallow angle. That way I'm less likely to gouge the surface and damage it. This is a pretty easy process to go through, just a matter of scraping off the gunk. Really you need to remove that layer for this to be effective and get down deeper into the finish. With that first thick layer of finish scraped off, I'm now getting closer to the wood. This process is really just keep applying the stripper and scraping it off and getting closer and closer to the wood until you're at the point where you can scrub it down with steel wool. Stripping a flat surface is one thing, but when it comes to turnings, it's much more difficult. The process here is I've applied 2 coats of stripper let them sit, soak in, and then scrape off as much of the gunk as I possibly can. That gets me so I can start freeing up the surface and working with other tools. But there's a few techniques I've used here. One of them is to hold the putty knife and turn the turning, sort of get yourself into a groove and move it along. And other points, it's just scraping the surface. Again, it's just moving as much material as you can and getting it off those legs. Once I've got that first layer off, it's a matter of coating everything and keeping it wet, working through, making sure I've got all the pieces done. I find that using a combination of steel wool and immediately wiping it with some rags help clear off that surface. A wire brass brush can be helpful when you're getting into the small areas. It's a good way to clean them off, but you have to be careful you're not doing some damage as you're going through. And then steel wool is what I use to finally clean everything off. If you've got a favorite technique that you like to use, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. It'll help other viewers learn how to do this.
With all the finish stripped off the parts, I can now see the surfaces and decide what my next steps are. There's a pretty consistent color tone across these parts here. They've all got a little bit of a purplish reddish color to them. But the problem I've got is on the main surface here, there are a number of blemishes on the tabletop. You can see one here, there's another one here, there's some across here and here, and there's also some old wear marks here and here. So I've got a very inconsistent look here in the stain. This would be impossible to make look perfect. This is solid wood, so I'm going to sand it down so I've got a good base to start with, and I'm going to sand this down as well so that both of these are the same. When I purchased this cloverleaf table with a damaged top, I made sure it was solid wood. That gave me the most number of options to be able to repair this. I can sand this down without any risks. If this was a veneer top, I might blow through the veneer and create even more problems. So I hope that helps you in terms of what you might be shopping for when you're looking at damaged antiques. I'm going to put on my respirator and get to sanding. With the surfaces all sanded down, I want to take a look at this tag to see if I can learn a little bit more about this furniture and maybe what to do with the stain. It looks like the National Company started in the 1860s and then in 1890 established factories in Walkerton and Southampton, and those are the names that are on here. So I know this is produced after that date. Now, looking at some of the tooling on here and some of the wood used, I don't think it's actually that old, and I'll show you why. If I look across the grain here, I can see marks from a planer blade. And what that means is this whole tabletop was run through a machine to get it perfectly flat. If this was done by hand and it was planed, the underside of this table they wouldn't have invested time in. So this was definitely a machine surface. You can see these are perfectly cut out parts here. These are recessed screws to hold on the legs, and they're machined very well. So it's telling me this was some advanced machinery that was used to put these together. So likely more modern than old. When I try to figure out the age of furniture, I also look at the boards. If this was a tabletop made of 2 boards, it would tell me it's an older piece of furniture because wood was harvested in much larger pieces. But if I count the boards here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boards making up the small tabletop. So it's telling me this is more modern. Now you can see this wood is quite light, and this is a natural piece of mahogany. The colors are quite different. So I think what they were looking to do here is mimic mahogany, which would be an expensive piece of furniture, and I think they've done that in a couple layers of stains. So let's take a closer look and I'll show you what I mean by that. So going from the bare wood, if you look at the bottom sides of both of these tables, you can see there's a brown stain. So this would have been the first coat that went on. And then on the edge here, you can see this reddish color. So this would have been the red introduced to start mimicking mahogany. And then on top of that would have been a coating that would have been also tinted to get it dark. And so it had that undertone of brown and the red to give that look of mahogany. Here's the leg that I stripped. You can see it's got that reddish tone. So this is likely after those 2 coats of stains. So this is what I need to mimic to get it back to looking like mahogany. Now I found this looking kind of purplish. So I'm not going to go exactly with the way it was, but we're certainly going to make it look like a nice warm brown tone. One more hint that tells me this was intended to be a dark finish is the sanding marks on the turnings. When you're doing turnings with natural wood, you want to make sure there aren't any sanding marks. But when I look at this closely, I can see that there are sanding marks across the whole turning. So this was intended to be coated in a very dark finish. I start the staining process by using dye stain and spraying it on. Then after it's dried, I go through and just slightly sand it with sandpaper, and that takes off any loose dust and just evens out the stain. Now I'm using dye stain, and the reason is because it penetrates deeply into the grain and will accentuate the grain. If I use general hardware store stain that you wipe on, that's called a pigmented stain, it actually obscures the grain. So I'm hoping that this is really going to lend itself to when I put the final finish on this and go through the French polishing process to bring out the grain. I stained this with burnt umber, and you can see on this finishing wheel here, the burnt umber lines up very well with that color. I need to get this a little more red so that it matches better with the mahogany. This is a finisher's wheel if you've never seen this before. I'll leave a link in the video description. And if I want to add red to the burnt umber, I rotate that over here and I can see what that's going to look like. So I don't think I want it quite that red, but it gives me an idea that it's getting closer to the mahogany look I'm looking for. By using dye stains, you can get an infinite number of colors. So I'm just going to put alcohol in here. And then I need to measure this carefully. So I need about 3 parts here of the raw umber. And then I don't want to contaminate my red, so I'll clean that off. And then I need about 1/3 red. And look how intense that color is. So I'm going to try about that much. And we'll see what this looks like. So on a scrap piece of pine, I'll just dab a little bit on here, see what that looks like. There's a hint of red to it, but not that much. And the color intensity isn't there either. So I need to adjust the color, and we'll try it again. I'll try this again, and we'll see what this looks like. So it's definitely a more intense color, which is good. Okay, it's slightly more red. Let's see. That's getting closer to the neighborhood that I'm looking for. So it's going to react differently on the wood that I'm using versus this pine, but this is just giving me an idea of how much red is in that. I can now strain the paint into the sprayer, and here's a good use for a spreader clamp. If you haven't seen my video on testing spreader clamps, I'll leave a link in the video description. So I'll just give this one more quick stir here. And the reason that you want to filter this is because sometimes the dye doesn't fully dissolve, and this will just catch any of those pieces that didn't quite dissolve, and they won't end up leaving spots on your piece. You can see right there at the end, there's a bit of red. Okay, we're ready to go. The stain's dried here, and I'm giving the legs a sanding. When you strip something, you do need to give it a light sanding, and you can see what that does. It's a little bit lighter on the sanded leg versus the one I haven't sanded yet. So this will give me a better read, and I think from a color perspective, I need a darker tone to go on here, just to get that in the same range. Now, antique tabletops are usually lighter than the rest of the table, so they don't need to be exactly the same, but I do need to get it a little bit darker than what it is. I've also noticed as I've been sanding these parts that the open areas here are where those scratch marks are that I showed you earlier, and I don't think that's from the wood turning. I would see scratches all along here if that was the case. It's likely from someone who put steel wool on this and was too aggressive with it when they were cleaning it off. So this is something that I'll sand out as I go through, but that's another hint that you can look at for something that's been refinished before. This stain mixture has raw umber, burnt umber, and a little bit of red. As you can see, everything's dried now, and I've finished sanding the legs, and the color is a much closer match. I'm now ready for the most exciting part for me, and that is trying French polishing for the first time. I've been reading about this. It's a 4-step process, and it should end up with a mirror finish. This is my own piece, so I'm willing to experiment on this to see how it works. So I'll share with you what I'm doing. I'm not guaranteeing results here, but I'm going to give it a try and see how it works. French polishing has 4 steps to it. The first one is the fill, and that fills all the grain and makes sure it's nice and smooth. So I need to create what's called a rubber or a tampon, and I've got some cotton prepared here, You typically use wool for the inside, but I don't have wool. I'm using cotton for this. So I'm putting it in the center. And then I have to keep unrolling this and rolling this. But basically, you can see there's shellac coming through here. So I'm using garnet shellac. It's very dark, and it's going to add richness to this piece. You want to use garnet shellac when you're using dark wood, and you can use lighter shellac on lighter woods. I make my own shellac using garnet shellac flakes. What I do is fill up a container and then cover it up with denatured alcohol, and that gives me about an 8-pound cut. It takes about 36 hours for this to dissolve down. You can speed up the process if you grind these in a coffee grinder, but this is the process that I use. This 8-pound cut is now what I use to mix up the shellac. So I'm typically using a 2-pound cut, and I use a container here that has gradients on the side so I can see the measurements that I'm putting in. So I need to put in 1 part of the 8-pound cut to 3 parts of the denatured alcohol, and that will give me the consistency that I need. And you can see from the stir stick here, this has all kinds of garnet shellac on it from when I was stirring this. So it's a really rich finish. This shows you how you can make garnet shellac. The first step here, because I've got stain, is just to go through and seal off the wood with the shellac. So it's not dispensing any yet. As I said, this is a learning process for me, so we'll see how this goes. Maybe something that I can do more of in the future as I get more experienced, and I can share with you some techniques. You can see some of the stain coming off there as well. Okay, I'll let that dry for about an hour and then come back. Pumice is a very fine powder, and it's an important part of this process for a couple of reasons. I've got the pumice in some cotton tied up in something called a pounce bag. It allows you to dispense it in a very fine powder. Then what happens is you rub it into the surface, and the pumice goes transparent once it's mixed with shellac. So it's filling those voids. It's also slightly abrasive, so it can grind down the surface and make it glass smooth. It's really important to make sure there are no voids, any depressions in the surface to get a really nice shine. Where you've got those little voids and depressions, that will give you more of a semi-gloss finish, and what we're looking for here is a high gloss finish. So this is a really important step in the French polishing process. Well, that didn't go how I planned. You can see here on the surface I've got some dark marks. I was warned in this book that I'm using that if you put too much pumice on, it can ball up on you and then you have to sand it out. Not only that, I was too aggressive on this side trying to work out these balls, and I've now got a lighter area here than I do on these areas. So I might have really botched this. I might have to take it all back, sand it back down, and start over again. This is part of the learning process, and the resource that I'm using is this book here. This is a great book by Sam Allen. It's no longer in print, but you can probably pick it up for $5 to $10 used. This is the French polishing process. Great detail in it, some great photos, and it also covers off the British method. So there's a couple different ways to do French polishing. Both of the issues I had on this table here were warnings in this book. The pumice building up, wearing through the stain, they were both warnings, but until I had any practical experience, I didn't know where the boundary was. So now that I know where that boundary is, I can work on this table. This might have been a hard lesson. I might have to strip this right back to bare wood and start over again. So let's move on to this one. We'll fill this and then move on to step 2 in the French polishing process. I've gently filled this over 3 different coats, and I've got it nice and smooth. Now I need to let it sit for a little bit before I move on to the second stage of French polishing, and that's called bodying. So while I've got some time, there were a few things I was putting off because I knew I'd have this working time, and one of them is correcting the damage that's on the edge of this table. So this has got decorative tacks around the outside, and I've got a section that's missing and another section that's damaged. So I'm going to take these tacks off, prepare the edge, and get them ready for the new tacks that will go on at the end of the finishing process. These look like upholstery tacks, but there's a nail here and here, so I just need to work my way underneath this and pry them out. And I'll try to save this material for a future project. I'm carefully scraping off any lumps of finish that are stuck on here from the previous finish. And then I need to go on this beveled edge in the bottom here as well. You can see here there's some old finish, sort of a drip. So there's another drip there. And once I've got it like this, it's just a matter of going over it with 120 sandpaper and cleaning it up. It takes a bit of elbow grease to get through this, but you'll end up with a nice clean edge like this one here. Well, I've got this upside down. I'm going to put a coat of shellac on here, and I tried taking this tag off, but it's starting to tear. So what I'm going to do is put a plastic cover on that when I'm done here. So I'll just have to work around it as I work through putting this coat of shellac on. So I'm just going to go with probably about a 2-pound cut here. And you can see here I've actually worn through the pad. That's how abrasive that pumice is once you start rubbing with it. So I'll just go around the edges here. And this wood is fairly thirsty just because it has nothing on it right now. But it's always good practice to make sure you finish not just the top of a table, but the bottom as well. And what that does is it slows the process of absorbing moisture. If the moisture changes in the air rapidly, when you're going through season changes, you could have the table warp on you because it's absorbing more moisture on one side than another. I'm going to put a few more coats of shellac just on the edges, get them all prepped, and then we'll move on to the top. I'm doing this one-handed because I want to be able to move the table around and not contaminate the top with any shellac that happens to be on my other glove. Before I start the bodying, I'm just using an ultra-fine Scotch-Brite pad. So this is synthetic steel wool. Just rub it down, take off any potential nibs on here, and then we're all ready to go. Yeah, that's nice and smooth. You can see it's already becoming shiny. So the purpose isn't really to make it shiny at this point, it's to make sure that you're building up the body of the shellac. So large circular motions are how this process starts, then transitioning to a figure 8, and you should be getting clouds as you go through with that oil on the film, and that's what I'm getting here. So it's working. This is what it looks like at the end of the bodying stage, and for anyone who's done this before, I'd love to hear a critique if this is looking right. I have no frame of reference, so I'm just going based on what I'm reading, but it's pretty smooth and shiny. The next stage is going to make it smoother. I'll just take a closer look here. I'm not quite sure whether that's got enough shellac on it or not. I'm going to let this sit for a day and then move on to step 3. While I'm letting the top sit, you can see the leg here is still looking a little red compared to the top. So what I want to do is, before I put the shellac on, mix a color in that will get it less red and more brown. Now, if we take a look at the color wheel, you can see the opposite of red is green. So if I add green to the shellac, it should reduce the red and get us closer to the brown color we're looking for. I don't have any green, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to mix this up. And in order to see what I'm doing, I'm going to mix it up with a bit of alcohol first to make sure I'm getting the green that I'm looking for. So I'll just mix this up periodically as I'm working, and I've got a thin rag here because I need to get into all these grooves. So shellac just rubs on, it dries real quick. So there's no jig that I have to set up for this to put finish on it, because by the time I'm done on one end, it'll be dry enough I can actually hold it and just flip it around. You can see the difference here, how it's starting to knock back the red, so a couple more coats should be good. This leg now has 2 coats of the shellac with the green in it, and this one has only 1. So this is getting me where I want to be, so I'll switch over to just garnet shellac after I do the second coat on this one. So here you can see the rag I was using, it's got green on it, so that was the tint that was in there. And the nice thing about shellac is that when you dispose of it, it's non-toxic. So I just pour it into cat litter, and once the cat litter absorbs it, you can throw it in the garbage. No toxic waste to deal with. The third step here is called stiffing, and I'm just going to put a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of shellac on here, and start with a figure 8 motion, and just get a little bit of oil on the surface. And this is where you really have to put a lot of pressure on this. So I've got my thicker gloves on. These are 6mm gloves instead of my regular 3mm, because this is really, they sometimes call this friction polish, and at this stage, this is where you get your workout. So I want to keep moving in this figure 8 pattern, and you never want to stop. I just stopped there, that's not good. And what we're doing here is smoothing out the finish of what I put on yesterday.
The last step is called spiriting off, so I'll just take some clean rags I have here, put them inside. So this will be my tampon, and I'm just going to put some straight alcohol on here. There's no shellac involved in this process at all. So I haven't used one of these before, so I'll have to break it in with enough alcohol that it starts to come through the surface. Not yet. And really this last step, what it's called is spiriting off. What I'm doing is just taking off the oil that's left on from when I lubricated the rubber or tampon. So it's just cleaning off the finish. All I'm doing is going with the grain, and I'm cleaning off the oil.
I'm really happy with how this French polish worked out. I see some room for improvement, but I'll get better with time, and I'll share some tips with you as I grow my skills in this area. I've got this shelf I have to deal with here. I've got to put more shellac on the legs, and then I can get to assembling this, and we can take a look at the final restoration. All the parts are ready to be assembled, and I'll show you the details of that. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit more about shellac. As I said before, shellac was displaced by lacquer because it dries very quickly, but lacquer is also more durable than shellac. Shellac can be damaged by heat, it can be damaged by alcohol and other solvents, so you want to make sure that you're using a coaster when you've got a table like this. Shellac also has an advantage that it's a repairable finish. Because it can be dissolved with alcohol, you can rejuvenate a finish instead of having to strip it off. I show an example of that in the T-cart restoration project I did. You can see here the alligatored finish that was before. Going through the amalgamation process rejuvenated the finish and allowed me to retain it, keep it in place, and restore it to the original look. If you're interested in learning more about shellac, I've learned from a number of different books. There's some that I recommend here. Taunton's Complete Illustrated Guide to Finishing is one by Jeff Jewett. Another one is Understanding Wood Finishing. This one's by Bob Flexner. And a third one is 25 years of fine woodworking tips. This is Finishing Methods of Work. I'll put a link to these in the video description. Now let's get to putting this table together. I'll start by putting this on a protected surface, and then I'm going to put these brackets back on here. So these are the mounting spots for the legs, and I find it interesting. As I move this piece in the light, you can see there's some shiny areas. This is from the hide glue, but the big clue is right here. This brittle part here, this is the hide glue itself. Now, because this is hide glue and I'm using hide glue to put it together, I don't need to clean out the mortise because hide glue will reactivate the old hide glue, so this makes my job a little bit easier. If this wasn't hide glue, I'd have to clean out the mortise, clean off the tenon, because when you're dealing with carpenter's glue, yellow glue, cabinet maker's glue, you need clean wood surfaces for it to work. So I'm going to screw this on next, and the next piece I want to show you is how these screws go in. So wood movement, as I've talked in many videos, is important. I'll move this out of the way. The wood grain runs this way, which means this table wants to expand and contract with seasonal movement. And if I were to screw that down tightly, when it wants to contract, the table would crack. And these craftsmen knew that. As you can see here, the screw hole is bigger than the screw. So what that does is allows the tabletop to move slightly with seasonal wood movement changes. So in the wintertime when it shrinks down, it's got a little bit of room to move, and in the summertime when it expands, it's got a little bit of room to move. That way, this tabletop isn't going to crack over years of seasonal wood movement. So what I'll do is I'll just line these cleats here with the old screw holes, and then screw them all in. If you've never seen one of these, this is called a Yankee screwdriver. It's the first cordless screwdriver. I remember seeing one of these when I was maybe in grade 1 or grade 2. The janitor was fixing something in the room and he was using one of these, and I was just totally fascinated with it. So it's a pretty neat tool. So that's one side. This is the other side. I just need to make sure that the mortises are flaring out on the right angle. And I just realign these holes. and it's pretty straightforward to attach them. Now these screws are in good shape. The screws that were in the legs and through the shelf, they're not in good shape, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Of these 3 screws here, this one here is bent, so I have to replace that one. And you can see the heads on these. Someone actually cut a slot in here to be able to extract the screw. This one's a little bit worn. This one is really worn. So these aren't going to work for me putting them back in again. I'm going to dig into my screw supply and find some replacements. I use peanut butter jars a lot in my shop. So a tip for you, if you use one of these silicone gel packs, it prevents the screws from rusting further. So I'll pick out a few that should be the same size. That one works. And that one works. And the heads, they look good. There's one more. So we're all set to go. The next part is to dry fit these. Now, when the legs were put on here before, 2 were at one angle and one was at a very obvious wrong angle, so I never labeled the parts when I took them apart. So what I need to do is find the screw hole for the shelf. That goes to the inside of the circle here. And I just need to play around with these to figure out which one goes where to work best. So 2 of these are very similar. And the third one looks a little bit different on the tenon. All the tenons have this shoulder part that goes all the way around, except for this one, it's smooth right here in this one spot. So because this is different than the other 2, I suspect this is the one that needs to go in this mortise. Now because I'm making an assumption here, I want to prove this out to make sure I don't have wet glue and I'm fumbling around with parts. So I'm going to put the shelf in now, and the wood grain here has to be oriented the same as the wood grain on the top. So I get it this way. I'll install these screws, and then, ooh, that's a tight fit. So this is an important part of assembling pieces back together again, making sure you're clear on your plan of how you're going to glue this together. See, even these 2 parts don't want to go together, so I'm going to have to, I think, screw these legs on first and then put the tenons in the mortises. So if I put this down here now, I can get that in. Let's see this one. Okay, I can get that in. Yeah, this is going to be a little tricky. Now there's a little bit of a lip on the turning right here. So I'm going to see if perhaps I can use that to temporarily hold this in place. Let's see. Okay, that looks like that might work. Let's give this a try. I'll line that up. That screws a little bit off from the center. Okay, I think it started. Let's give it a try. Okay, I think I got it. So screw number 2, it looks like it's lined up there. And then screw number 3. Let's see, is that lined up? That's looking pretty good. Okay, so we'll stand this up and see what it looks like. So this is the leg that looked a little bit odd last time. So the angle there, matching these. Let's see. This one is a little bit on an angle. That one looks straight. Oh, so if I sight it through these legs, I can see what it looks like. One, two, that one's crooked. Three, that one's straight. Huh, that's interesting. Oh, this screw isn't quite tight here. That one's tight, that one's tight. I see a problem here. This leg here isn't being pulled in tight, so that screw position must be the wrong leg. So I'm going to flip these legs around and see if that fixes the problem. Now all the joints are nice and tight. I'll turn it right side up and see how it looks. Okay, so these aren't seated in here, which will change it just slightly. Huh, that looks like success to me. Before I do the glue up, I want to look at the edge here. I'm a little conflicted. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is the new tack decorative strip I've got for it, but as I'm holding it up here, it's giving me a 1980s leather jacket studded kind of vibe, and I'm not sure whether I want that on here. The profile here matches the lower shelf. This is the new decorative tack strip I've got, but as I'm holding it up here, it's giving me a little bit of a 1980s leather jacket studded vibe. I'm not sure whether I want that on here. The profile edge on the top matches the profile edge on the shelf here, so I think they balance out pretty well. Since this gets nailed on, I think I'm going to leave it off for now, but I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments. Would you put the tack strip on here or leave it off? I'm going to move on now to gluing up. So I'll just pop these out. They're fairly loose. And the best way to get glue in a mortise is to use the back of an artist brush. Now, I've heated up my hide glue a little bit. It can move pretty slow. I find that Titebond works better in cold workshops than Old Brown, but just seems to gel up far too quickly. Brush some glue on the tenon here. Make sure I've got good coverage all the way around, and we're good to go. I'll just put the tenons inside the mortises, grab a mallet, and set them in. So the last thing I've got to do now is just fill holes on the edge of this table, and this is the best time to do that. If you try to put wood filler in before a finish, you'll never match the wood filler. But if you've got a finished piece and then you put the wood filler in with burn-in wood filler, you can match that color exactly. I'll show you very quickly how I do that, and then I'm going to set up this table and we'll do some before and after photos so you can see the difference of what this table started off like and what it looks like now. I'll also remind you, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do so. We tried to get to 100,000 subscribers this year, and this is our last video of the year. We got over 70, so that's great. Thank you for your support on that. Here's the hole right here, and all I'm going to do is take a little bit of this color, a little bit of a dark color, let that harden for a second, and then come back with a scraper and see how that does. The nice thing about burn-in wood fillers is you can adjust them as you go. So if you end up with a color that's slightly off, you can easily tweak it with another color. There's a slight burr on the edge here from the French polishing, so I'll just sand that down, give it one more coat of shellac, and we'll be good to go. I'll give you one last look at the French polish here using a couple of my favorite Dutch treats for the holidays. My family really enjoys these. If you know what they are, let me know in the comments. For 2023, we've got a few things lined up. We're working on some merch, so if you're interested in something like this, you can go to our website, wouldn'titbenice.ca, and sign up for our newsletter. We'll let you know when that comes out. Our first video for 2023, I know you're going to enjoy. It's also a shellac piece, and it's a barrister's bookcase where the finish has alligatored. So I'm going to amalgamate that finish, but I'm also going to tint it so that the various tones in the bookcase are all consistent and matching. Thank you for watching Fixing Furniture. Enjoy your holidays, and I'll see you in the new year.